Senator Robert Menendez here with us. Senator Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey, is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the most powerful Democrat in Congress on foreign policy matters. In September, he led the debate over the authorization of the use of force in Syria, which he and the committee ultimately voted to support. He has since been a strong voice in the upper chamber in favor of increasing aid to the organized, moderate opposition of Bashar Assad. While Menendez holds the respect of U.S. President Barack Obama and his administration, the New Jersey chairman is keen on proving the worth of the Senate on foreign policy and considers the legislature an equal branch of government on affairs abroad. Menendez's signature legislation since becoming chairman, after replacing Secretary of State John Kerry, drafted last year, would sanction Iran harshly for its continued nuclear work. He and his colleagues revised that bill after the P5+1, the US, UK, France, Russia, China, and Germany, plus the EU, reached an interim agreement in Geneva with Iran last year. The new bill, the Nuclear Weapons-Free Iran Act of 2013, would trigger new sanctions tools against Iran should diplomatic talks fail to achieve a comprehensive solution to the long-standing impasse. A group of 59 senators from across party lines co-sponsored the bill, but President Obama threatened to veto the measure in his State of the Union address, warning that its passage would derail the negotiations. Throughout it all, Chairman Menendez did not waver in his belief that a diplomatic track must be coupled with prospective sanctions. With that firm position, Senator Menendez is the personification of the phrase, "You have to say what you mean and mean what you say." The firmness of purpose and resoluteness of character is what propels Senator Menendez forward every day as New Jersey's senior senator, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and a true friend of Israel. Senator Bob Menendez.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve, for your gracious introduction. I'm pleased to join all of you today. The Jerusalem Post's annual conference has always been an incredibly well-attended event, and clearly this year's no exception. Since the Post's origins in 1925, it has been a voice for the Jewish people who, when the Post was founded, considered it one of the most effective means of influencing British authorities at the time. And we all know what has happened since, and through it all, the Jerusalem Post has survived, it has prospered, and has remained a powerful voice for the Jewish people. So I salute the Post for bringing us all together. Today, many years have passed since the Post was first published, and we find ourselves talking about a new Middle East, which is this year's conference's theme. The question none of us can answer with any degree of confidence is, what will the new Middle East look like? Will governments of the region seize the mantle of leadership and demonstrate a commitment to democratic transition, or will these societies continually be destabilized, driven by mass protests and violence as regimes resist political and economic reform? In short, will the new Middle East be an incubator of 21st century democracies like Tunisia, or will it be relegated to the dustbin of Iran-like fundamentalist theocracies bent on turning back the clock 500 years? Will it be free of brutal dictators and look to leaders who can set a foundation for free and open societies? Or will violent extremists seize the narrative and drive the notion that change can only come through violence and bloodshed? The history of the Middle East at the beginning of the 21st century is yet to be written. The history of Israel, however, is written in the strength of its democratic values and its unwavering place as America's most important partner in the region. So what we do know of the new Middle East is that Israel will remain a democratic anchor, and there will be no daylight between the United States and Israel. Of that, we must be certain, and as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I will continue to work to make sure there is no daylight between us no matter what happens. We all know that Israel is in an increasingly dangerous, unstable, and unpredictable neighborhood, making the strategic partnership with the United States even more imperative. The spread of extreme Islamist groups from the Hindu Kush across the heart of the Middle East to the Maghreb, driving Sunni Shia sectarianism, threatens to turn the promise of an Arab Spring into a long winter of discontent. It strengthens the worst players in the region, and it makes the regional and geopolitical outcome less predictable for Israel and the United States. Together, we are a pillar of regional stability, not because simply of the power of our military, but because of the power of our ideas and the passion with which we hold our democratic values. Together, Israel and the United States has been much more than military partners. We are united through our people, through cultural and educational exchanges, collaboration on breakthrough science and technology, on economic and agricultural issues, as well as our security. So the fact is, from my perspective, we are all conservative when it comes to Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. We are all conservative when it comes to keeping the people of Israel safe and secure in their homes and within their borders. And also we are all conservative when it comes to keeping Israel, independent, democratic, and Jewish. Now, as we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu in the last few weeks, and as we watch Secretary Kerry's latest shuttle diplomacy efforts run into obvious challenges that may in fact threaten the progress that has been made, we now recognize that there are clearly definable benefits to peace that could be realized throughout the Middle East if the peace process were to be able to continue. Though the road to peace is fraught with obstacles in every turn, the statements a few weeks ago by the Prime Minister previewed for us what a new Middle East could look like. It could be a Middle East in which a broader peace would have a positive spillover effect in the entire region. Benjamin Netanyahu himself emphasized at the recent AIPAC conference when he said peace would open up the possibility of establishing formal ties between Israel and leading countries in the Arab world. The combination of Israeli innovation and Gulf entrepreneurship, to take one example. He spoke of improving the region's water and energy situation, improving agriculture, improving education with e-learning, improving health with diagnostics on the internet. He suggested that Israel could help its Arab neighbors make scientific, agricultural, and technological advances that would help everyone prosper economically. The new Middle East could be a thriving place where the entrepreneurship of Dubai and Doha and the innovative skills and educational investments of Israel would help Arabs and Israelis build better, safer, more prosperous and secure lives for themselves and their neighbors. If the peace process had a committed partner, it could ultimately move closer to that vision of the new Middle East. But notwithstanding the Prime Minister's recent statements, notwithstanding our genuine hope that his words would one day become a reality, the bottom line remains as clear to me as it has always been. There can be no existential threat to Israel from its neighbors, period. There can be, as the Prime Minister said in a speech, no fantasy of flooding Israel with refugees, no movement to amputate parts of the Negev and the Galilee. Notwithstanding any hopes we may harbor, one thing is certain, and from my view is a conditioned precedent. President Abbas must recognize the Jewish state as a Jewish state without equivocation. In an ideal world, with an Israeli-Palestinian diplomatic breakthrough would come problem-solving, investment, entrepreneurship, and from that we would emerge with the possibility of a new Middle East that we could all embrace. But the challenges to that, in my mind, are all too clear. The first challenge is to keep the peace process moving forward with a committed partner, keeping everyone at the table rather than unilateral actions outside the negotiating framework. As to the broader situation in the Middle East, the day-to-day reality is all too lethal for too many people. Too many have lost their lives, too many have lost family members, too many have been wounded or displaced by the unchecked violence and the sectarian hatred that is spilling over borders and threatening to turn the fleeting dreams of an Arab Spring into an unending nightmare of despair. As the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I've worked to address these issues in a bipartisan effort. On Syria, my committee's authorization for the use of military force last September was the reason, and only reason, I am convinced, that Assad agreed to dismantle and destroy his regime's arsenal of chemical weapons. He decided to comply with the will of the international community only when he perceived U.S. military action to be imminent, clearly demonstrating that our willingness to use our military power can be a force for positive change. Now, hindsight is 20/20, and we may look back on that resolution as a missed opportunity to end the violence before it metastasized into an inoperable situation, and time will tell. But going forward, I believe the United States must reassure its partners, particularly in the Gulf, that we will not take the military option off the table when that force can be used to achieve clearly defined national security objectives. At the end of the day, I have led the committee in an effort to continue to promote political and economic reform across the region and globally, with a willingness to project the strength of our military when necessary, and the power of our values wherever and whenever democracy takes hold and people embrace the rule of law and good governance policies. And I will continue to lead the committee on the dual tracks of military strength and the strength of those democratic values embedded in the U.S. strategic partnership. In my view, both are needed if we are to protect our national security interests at home and the security of our friends across the world. Now, let me get to the issue that has dominated so much of my time as the author of every sanctions regime, most of the time with my colleague Mark Kirk of Illinois. It includes, he is a tremendous advocate, and I am thrilled to work with him in a strong bipartisan effort. And my view of having both military options available as well as which strengthens our capacity to achieve peacefully negotiated goals includes ensuring that Iran never has the ability to build even one nuclear bomb. When it comes to Iran, I think all of you know where I stand, what I believe in, and I have stood even against many in my own party who have a different view. I have worked on Iran's nuclear issues for 20 years. This is not a new endeavor for me. When I was in the House of Representatives and then on the House International Relations Committee, I found out that U.S. voluntary contributions to the International Atomic Energy Administration above and beyond our membership dues were going for what? They were going to create operational capacity at the Bushehr nuclear facility. And I was stunned. I said, this is not in the national interest of the United States, not in the national security of the United States, and certainly not in the national interest and security of our ally, the State of Israel. And I led a successful effort to end those voluntary contributions above and beyond. But for a decade, I was told that my concerns had no legitimate basis, that Iran would not be able to bring either the Bushehr plant online or that its activities were not the most major concern. And history has shown us that those assessments were wrong. about Iran's abilities, about Iran's intentions. They were simply wrong then, and I believe they are simply wrong now. If past is prologue, I am skeptical of Iran keeping any promise. And so let me give you my assessment of the way forward from the joint plan of action agreed to by the members of the P5+1 and Iran, and what we should expect before we move from the interim agreement we have to any possible final comprehensive agreement that verifiably, and we would hope permanently, dismantles Iran's nuclear weapons program. As I have said before, I repeatedly have said that I supported the diplomatic process to achieve the goal. But that diplomatic process must be reinforced by continuous international commitment to the sanctions regime against Iran. It is clear to me that only intense, punishing economic pressure has influenced Iranian leaders to come to the table in the first place. And so we cannot let them obfuscate and delay their way to dismantling the sanctions. For such a long time, the Iranians' process of obfuscation and delay has now led them to the precipice in which many in the Western world say, well, we have to agree to some level, even if it's small, but some level of nuclear enrichment. If that has been the process that has led them to this moment, we cannot let that be the process that leads them to a nuclear bomb. And we must ensure that the sanctions regime that we have built up globally does not come about. What troubles me, and what I believe troubles many of you, is that the international community seems to want any deal more than it wants a good deal. Let's understand that we need to ensure that Iran cannot delay away sanctions while they retain the ability to resume their weapons program at any time. The longer we let them delay, the swifter their research and development brings new, more powerful centrifuges, and the closer and quicker they get to that breakout capability. And it is that capability that must be dismantled. We cannot let the international sanctions regime unravel before we have a deal that verifiably dismantles Iran's ability to produce highly enriched uranium, a deal that fully addresses the weaponization aspects of Iran's nuclear program. The problem is that the mere possibility of sanctions relief has already brought a rush of business delegations to Tehran. So let me be clear. I support the administration's diplomatic efforts. I have always supported a two-track policy of diplomacy and sanctions. At the same time, I am convinced that we should only relieve pressure on Iran for verifiable concessions that will dismantle Iran's illicit nuclear program. And it be done in such a way that alarm bells will ring from Vienna to Tel Aviv to Washington should Iran try to restart its program anytime in the next 20 to 30 years. And that is what we will continue to pursue independently as we continue to monitor from the Foreign Relations Committee the P5+1 negotiations. But based on the parameters described in the Joint Plan of Action, the briefings I've had, and recent Iranian actions, I'm very concerned. And I do not forget that despite diplomatic entreaties to the Iranians in recent years where hands were extended and secret talks were pursued, Iran has grown its support and advocacy for terror. When Iran continues, in one sense, to charm at the negotiation table, but all other actions suggest that it's the same old game. Funding and supporting Hezbollah that has carried out attacks against American interests continues. 241 American servicemen died in the Marine Corps barracks bombing in Lebanon, 19 in the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia. In recent years, we've traced responsibility for lethal actions against American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the planned attack on the Saudi ambassador at a Washington restaurant in 2011 to Iran. Today, Iran is actively sponsoring the proxy war in Syria, sending money, weapons, and fighters every day. Simultaneously, it's cultivating terrorist networks in Iraq, Bahrain, Yemen, and beyond. as an insurance policy against any country that may challenge it, and promoting regional sectarian violence that could easily result in a broader regional conflict. And now they're sending an ambassador to the United Nations who was part of a student group that held Americans hostage in Tehran in 1979. They're sending missile shipments to Gaza and testing new missile systems. Make no mistake, while they are smiling at our negotiators across the table, they are plotting in the back room, and we must keep that in mind. So in my view, it's time to put Iranian rhetoric to the test. If we are to take President Rouhani's word when he said in Davos that Iran does not seek nuclear weapons, if that's true, then the Iranian government should not have any problems with the obvious follow-up to that claim, starting with the verifiable dismantling of its illicit nuclear infrastructure. That is all the sanctions legislation I have proposed would do. Finally, before I close, one final note. For those whose mission seems to be to delegitimize Israel at every turn, I am very clear that while the Holocaust may have been a defining moment in the history of the Jewish people, it is not the reason for Israel's right to exist. Israel's right to exist goes back millennia to Abraham and Sarah and beyond. There can be no denying the Jewish people a right to a land for which they have had a history for thousands of years. At the end of the day, we cannot know what the future will hold. We do not know what that new Middle East will look like. We do not know what will bloom from the shifting sands in the Middle East, soaked with the blood of people who want nothing more than to live in peace and prosperity. But what we do know, what we must understand, is that the United States will be the one to step up to help protect the Israeli people and counter the threat that they would be posed by a nuclear Iran. As we approach Passover and the celebration of the liberation of the Jewish people led from Egypt by Moses 3,300 years ago, we are reminded of the experience of the Jewish people with slavery and the modern-day forms of slavery that still keep the people of the Middle East in shackles: dictatorships, repression, lack of certain freedoms, poverty, illiteracy, and hunger. We are reminded how far we must go and how difficult it is on the journey to the new Middle East we would all want to see. Our task is to overcome the obstacles, seize the opportunity for a new story, a new narrative, a new exodus, one based on political representation, responsible leadership, and economic prosperity. This will be our journey to a new promised land that would benefit all nations and all people in the region, a land where Israelis and Arabs, Shia and Sunni, could live in peace with each other and with their neighbors. Until we get to that vision of the new Middle East, we must continue to stand with the one ally, a sea of democracy, an island of democracy and a sea of autocracy, and that is the state of Israel. I have never been moved more than in my very first trip to Israel. Some people ask me, why do you have this passion? I come from a family who, for different types of reasons, understand what Exodus is all about. My family came from Cuba, and I understand what Exodus is all about. I understand what freedom is all about. I understand the freedoms that come from that, and I was very moved when I went to Israel on my very first trip, where I was able to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, go to the Temple Mount, and to see others of other religious faiths openly be able to go to all of those places that have such significance for them, all be able to do it freely, because under Israeli administration, that was the possibility, which was not always the case. And so to see Israel's vibrant democracy, and to understand, having traveled throughout the country, that a country that is surrounded by neighbors that are hostile, whose back is to the sea, where you can go maybe on a good day from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in 45 minutes and cross the diameter of the country on a jet in just a matter of minutes. That is an enormous challenge for a democratic country rooted in millennia of history and surrounded by those who do not wish to recognize its existence. And that is why I am so firmly committed. This is our vision of a new Middle East, but it starts firmly rooted in the understanding that Israel not only has the right to exist, but has the right to exist as a Jewish state. And one day, this new vision of peace and prosperity, God willing, will happen. Until then, we stand firmly with our ally, the State of Israel. Thank you, and shalom.